important that the United States is showing up for partners around the world, but equally important to face the fact that America is showing. Diversity is the American and our country's superpower. However, far too often, the representation of the United States is not reflective of the full spectrum of backgrounds and experiences that America has to offer. And I know you agree with us on this. It's true for the workforce, but it's also true who the department works with. The president has set a goal to increase the share of contract dollars going to small and disadvantaged businesses to 15% across the federal government by fiscal 25. So I commend the State Department for already exceeding that goal. But, Mr. Secretary, let me tell you, that obscures the fact that Black, Asian Americans, and Hispanic-owned small businesses are getting less than 2% each of State Department contracts. That's 2% each. I believe African American-owned firms is at 1.9%. AAPI firms are at 1.45%, and Hispanic firms are at 1.9%. I'm a former 8A contractor, Mr. Secretary, in the 80s and 90s, and this is less than what was taking place in terms of contracting then. And so we have to understand and look at why these numbers are shockingly low. We've got to do a better job making sure that historically disadvantaged entrepreneurs get a larger share of the State Department contract. Members, Mr. Secretary, they're outraged, and so I intend to follow up, and I just wanted to let you know with a letter to the department asking you to outline the strategy to increase the share of contract dollars that go to all historically disadvantaged groups, and why Black and Asian American and Hispanic firms are being denied access to these contracts. Now, 20 years ago, after we first started talking about this three-legged stool of national security, diplomacy, development, and defense, we are no closer to bringing balance to that stool. In fact, we have never been so lopsided. The resources that we spend on defense dwarf the resources that we spend on our overseas presence, the pursuit of American interests, and our most basic partnerships to build a safer world. I'm sure that you see this every day. We over-rely on our military tools because that's what's available, meanwhile starving our civilian diplomatic tools. Our military understands this and is often the first to advocate for development and diplomatic tools that they see as necessary. However, successive Congresses have refused to make the investments needed to take the pressure off of military action. And now, once again, our diplomatic and development activities are facing the biggest cuts of any part of the United States government. We can't keep going on like this. If we're serious about confronting these challenges, then it must be reflected in our budget. Without sufficient development funding, we face a future struck by cycles of crises that require more and more humanitarian interventions and even military interventions and result in a less stable world. Secretary Blinken, you're currently crisscrossing the globe. You're listening to partners. You're hunting for joint solutions. And I'm sure getting an earful about United States policy. I'm eager to hear from you today what tools that you need, that the State Department needs to advance the mission of the United States and provide the leadership and partnerships of the world that the world, quite frankly, expects of us. What do you see as the cost of us stepping back and letting others fill the void? I see that everywhere in the world. What investments are we leaving on the table, the opportunities left untaken? What do you hear from our brave diplomats around the world and what they need to do their job? And I want to thank them for their service and their sacrifices, which they're making. And I want them to know that we do value their work in spite of these huge, horrific, terrible, deep cuts that are being proposed. So I look forward to our work together, Mr. Secretary, also with you, Chairman Diaz-Balart, and with all the members of this subcommittee, to make the case for why this bill needs to invest more this year and in future years to serve America, to serve the American people, and yes, quite frankly, our entire planet. So thank you, Mr. Secretary, and I yield back.
Thank you, Al. Now it's a privilege and honor to yield to the chairman of the Full Appropriations Committee, Mr. Tom Cole, for his opening statement. Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Chairman Diaz-Balart, Ranking Member Lee, Ranking Member DeLauro, and my fellow appropriators. I'm so pleased to be back with the State and Foreign Operations Committee. I previously served on this subcommittee, both with our distinguished Chairwoman Emeritus Kay Granger, Chairwoman Emeritus Nita Lowy, and the legendary Hal Rogers, Chairman Emeritus. So I know this committee is well stocked with talented people. Experience tells us that the work done before this committee is of critical importance to America's national security. Secretary Blinken, we appreciate your appearance before us today and your service to our country. There's no denying we're facing a time of increasing global disorder and rising threats to the security of the United States. We all know that historical analogies can be misleading, yet it is hard not to see haunting parallels between the conflicts raging across Europe and in the Middle East and another dark time in world history, the 1930s. The disturbing echoes of that dangerous decade are certainly before us. In Europe, Vladimir Putin's warped dream of a new Russian empire has led to the unjust and brutal invasion of his democratic neighbor, Ukraine. In the Indo-Pacific, the Chinese Communist Party continues its efforts to undermine the rules-based order, threaten Taiwan, and seek Chinese strategic domination in Asia and beyond. And in the Middle East, Israel faces threats on multiple fronts, beginning with the horrific attack launched by Hamas on October 7th. Even now, the terrorist regime in Iran is using missiles and proxies to threaten Israel and the United States' interests across the region. As you know, many of us on this panel were deeply disappointed at the administration's decision to pause very vital weapon transfers to our friend Israel. In my judgment, utilizing these weapons transfers as leverage over Israel's military decisions during this critical time is both dangerous and self-defeating. Moreover, withholding arms to Israel has our adversaries celebrating. It weakens Israel's deterrence against Iran as well as Hamas and Hezbollah. I'm deeply concerned over the signal it sends to these terrorists and enemies of both our nation and of Israel. Meanwhile, in what some have called an axis of upheaval, our sworn adversaries in Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran are increasingly joining hands to challenge us and to challenge Western institutions, democratic values, and the cause of freedom. The prospect of greater military, economic, and technological cooperation between these hostile authoritarian powers can only be deeply disturbing to the United States, our allies, and our partners. Here at home, the unprecedented flow of illegal immigrants across the southern border and the uptick in dangerous and deadly drugs such as fentanyl into our country have brought America to an important crossroads that demands clear leadership. Mr. Secretary, your budget request for the coming year aims to address some of these challenges, but I am concerned that in some respects it's missed the mark. I am pleased at the request to fully fund security assistance for Israel and Egypt, a proposed increase for the Indo-Pacific region, as well as for international narcotics and law enforcement funding, which is critical to countering the transnational criminal network trafficking in fentanyl and other deadly narcotics. I am, however, concerned that the budget proposes billions in additional mandatory funding and other budgetary gimmicks. These incentives appear to ignore our deteriorating fiscal outlook, and frankly, Congress is unlikely to adopt them. When your department or any executive branch agency resorts to budgetary gamesmanship rather than making the hard strategic choices necessitated by limited resources, it does a disservice to your cause. Mr. Secretary, again, I want to thank you and the men and women who serve in the Department of State for your service, and I look forward to your testimony and the dialogue to follow. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's always a pleasure to also yield to the ranking member of the full committees, Ms. DeLauro, for her opening statements.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Lee, and pleasure to have the chair at the meeting as well. Thank you, Secretary Blinken, for being here today and for what you and the devoted public servants of the Department of State do to protect Americans' security and interests, to project America's strength, share our values, celebrate our common cause with those who support freedom and democracy around the world. Unfortunately, the majority has recently revealed that they are prepared to cut the state and foreign operations funding bill by more than 11%. That would decimate your department's ability to conduct diplomacy around the world at a time when America's diplomatic might is as critical to our national security as our defense capabilities. Later in this hearing, I plan to ask you about the damage to our diplomatic capabilities that a $7 billion cut to the State Department's funding bill would bring, and the losses it would entail for State Department personnel, from Foreign Service officers to aid workers. We are at a critical juncture in our history. Wars in Europe and the Middle East have tested our nation's resolve. I was greatly disturbed and still am by the majority's lack of resolve to pass security and humanitarian aid for months while our allies waited. Our adversaries took advantage and humanitarian disasters unfolded. But thankfully, despite the majority's unnecessary delays, we did pass the supplemental security funding. We showed our trusted allies that we have their back and that our word can be counted on. I believe it is our duty to support Ukraine's victory over Russia. We cannot let Vladimir Putin be successful in his ambition to expand Russia's territory by force. Of course, arms and munitions are not all we are providing Ukraine. The State Department is administering $9.5 billion in forgivable loans to support Ukraine's government, its energy sector, and other infrastructure, and its first responders, healthcare workers, and teachers. And I look forward to learning more about how you are working to ensure Ukraine's economic stability. And in the Middle East, while we must support Israel's defense against aggression from Iran and its proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah, the situation in Gaza is increasingly dire. 1.1 million Gazans, half its population, are on the brink of famine due to this conflict. We have a moral obligation to ensure that humanitarian aid appropriated and obligated by this Congress can reach Gazans, and we must ensure that this conflict does not spread. These are not just feel-good activities. They are central to the security of Israel, the United States, and the region for generations into the future. While the situation on the ground in Israel and Gaza is urgent, commands our attention, the State Department is also leading negotiations to secure the release of the hostages and must prepare for the future of this region. And I know you agree that planning with regional partners must happen now, and how we bring about a ceasefire and a peaceful end to this conflict. All of this takes resources. And even as these conflicts continue, the State Department is also focused on the growing influence of China throughout the world, as the State Department works to preserve the rules-based international order through diplomacy. Moreover, China is rapidly expanding its military and technological capabilities. The State Department's work is crucial to maintaining the United States' competitive advantage, and that work, again, requires sufficient resources. There is a small faction in this Congress that believes that we should put America first by building walls between us and the rest of the world. I strongly believe that we put America first by demonstrating the power of American leadership, that we have the strength and the determination and the heart to fight for the most vulnerable people, protect the freedom of our allies, and share American values around the world. I thank you for appearing before this subcommittee, and I thank you for your public service to our country. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Secretary Blinken, as you know, your full written statement will be placed in the record. Obviously, feel free to summarize your testimony, as we said before. Thank you for being here, and now you are recognized, sir.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Always good to be with you. Chairman Cole, thank you for being here this morning. Ranking Member Lee, Ranking Member DeLauro, all of the distinguished members of the subcommittee, thanks for the opportunity this morning to testify before you. And thank you for the partnership that we have had to work to advance American leadership in a world at a time when it is so essential having that leadership in order to deliver on the priorities that actually matter to our people here at home. I think the need for U.S. global leadership and cooperation with allies and partners has never been greater. If we're not engaged, if we're not leading, then we know someone else will, and likely not in a way that advances our interests and values. Or maybe even worse, no one does, and then you're going to have a vacuum that's filled by bad things before it's filled by good things. At the same time, we know that the very nature of the problems that we face, a greater multiplicity and a greater complexity, requires cooperation, coordination, work with allies and partners. That's more imperative than it's been in my time here as well. People's Republic of China is pursuing military, economic, geopolitical preeminence, challenging our vision for a free, open, secure, and prosperous international order. Russia's committing aggression not only against Ukraine, but against the principles at the heart of the United Nations Charter: sovereignty, territorial independence and integrity, independence, which are the very building blocks of global peace and security. In the Middle East, we've been standing with Israel in its efforts to ensure that what happened on October 7th never happens again, as we do everything we can to bring about an end to the terrible human suffering of Palestinians in Gaza and to prevent the conflict from spreading to other fronts. U.S. leadership is needed to address humanitarian crises elsewhere around the world, including in Sudan, Haiti. We've seen millions of people in many other places displaced and killed. We have to focus, and we are, on them. And also to address, as many of you said, the global issues that no one country can solve alone, whether that's food security, the changing climate, transnational corruption, the fentanyl crisis.
The lies, greed, and hypocrisy of our democracy have been exposed. Free Palestine to free us all.
Mr. Secretary.
All liberation struggles are connected. You should be arresting Blinken, not me. You should be arresting Blinken, not me.
We will not have disturbances in this committee. Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But with the support of Congress, we can and we are approaching these challenges from a position of strength. Because of the actions we've taken, the United States is stronger economically, militarily, diplomatically than we were a few years ago. We've made historic investments here at home in our competitiveness, in our innovation, in our infrastructure. We've renewed our alliances. We built new ones and secured unprecedented alignment with key partners in Europe and Asia and beyond. We've delivered essential American aid to Ukraine, and we've called the international community to share the burden. For every dollar that we've spent in Ukraine, economic or development assistance, others have collectively invested 3 more. Now, I know there was doubt about whether bipartisan support for Ukraine and other urgent national security priorities could endure, but last month, Congress demonstrated to the world that we will not pull back when you passed President Biden's supplemental funding bill by an overwhelming margin. Our investment abroad does not come at the expense of our strength at home. Far from it. Most of the supplemental is being spent here in the United States, building up our own defense industrial base, supporting thousands of good American jobs. But we need to keep up this momentum. That requires a State Department budget that we fully resource so that we can actually meet the challenges of this moment. The FY25 budget the President's put forward, requesting $58.8 billion to the State Department and USAID, does that in 2 key ways. First, it funds the essential missions of our department and USAID. The budget will ensure that the United States continues to be the partner of choice for countries around the world when they turn to us and look to us to help them solve problems that they're trying to solve, but that are also profoundly in our interest to help solve. In an era of renewed great power competition, we have to present the strongest possible offer, one that is relevant and responsive to countries' needs, and one that advances our security and economic interests. That's why we're requesting, among other things, $2 billion for a new fund to build high-quality, sustainable infrastructure around the world. Crucially, investments like these create jobs for Americans and expand markets for our businesses overseas. We're requesting resources for the World Bank. With $1 billion in U.S. funding, we can unlock another $36 billion in development fund capacity to direct to the top priorities of emerging economies. That's an enormous return on our investment and essential for competing with China around the world. The budget also includes $1.7 billion for international organizations, including the UN, APEC, the Inter-American Development Bank, to help shape them in ways that reflect our interests and our values. We're asking for $500 million to give more people around the world access to secure internet and digital technologies. Doing that will support the U.S. economy through the export of our technology products. It will also ensure that we and our fellow democracies remain the leaders and standard bearers in key technologies, including artificial intelligence. Our budget includes funding to address global issues that affect the lives and the livelihoods of the American people, as well as people around the world, especially the synthetic drug crisis. It also funds our response to irregular migration, global food insecurity, public health, climate, and energy security. We're also asking Congress to fully fund the State Department's educational and cultural exchange programs. They're one of the best, most cost-effective tools that I've seen for advancing our values and interests around the world. They support the students, the researchers, the young professionals from our communities who study and work abroad. They connect us in the world with the world in powerful human ways. To outcompete our strategic rivals, we need to invest in the foundation of our strength abroad, and that is our diplomatic corps, and that's the second pillar of the budget. Our budget makes a strong investment in expanding our overseas presence, opening posts in the Pacific Islands and the Eastern Caribbean. As was noted, we want to make sure that we are represented at the ambassadorial level and that we have posts everywhere so that we can effectively represent our interests everywhere. We'll also continue our modernization of our diplomacy. We have reorganized the department in ways to make it better fit to address the challenges that we face in this moment. We're working to attract and retain the best talent, again, needed to take on these challenges. We're investing in our people in Washington and overseas with training, with technology, with support. We're promoting greater agility, greater innovation, greater efficiency in our processes. Last year's enacted budget represented a 5% cut from the year before. That challenges our efforts to deliver results that Congress expects and the American people deserve. So I urge you to support this budget, which helps us address the most pressing foreign policy priorities for the coming year and lays the foundation for continued strong American leadership in the years ahead. With that, I'm happy to address any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Members, as usual, I'll call members based on seniority of those present when the hearing was called to order, and alternating between each side. Each member will have 5 minutes for questions and responses, and I anticipate that we should have enough time for 2 rounds of questions. Mr. Secretary, I will start in the Western Hemisphere. Just ask you, you're aware, right, that in Cuba, the FBI's top 10 most wanted terrorist, Joan Chesimard, is harbored, right, by the regime. Mm-hmm. You're aware of that?
Yes.
You're aware that bombmaker William Morales of the FALN, responsible for the murder of 4 Americans, injuring 50 in New York, is also harbored by the regime in Cuba. Mm-hmm. You're aware as well that the ELN and FARC terrorists are harbored there?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You're aware that the regime did not cooperate in the investigation regarding the so-called anomalous health incidents, the sonic health attacks against U.S. personnel. Mm-hmm. You're aware of that, right? You're aware that the Cuban dictatorship has a very extensive espionage network. The most recent case that was very public was the State Department's Victor Manuel Rocha, who pled guilty of spying for decades on Cuba's behalf. And you're aware of that, I'm assuming, as well, Mr. Mm-hmm. Secretary. You're aware that the Cuban regime recently signed a military agreement with Belarus to train Cuban nationals, and then Cuban nationals are traveling to Russia to fight, for Russia against Ukraine, correct, sir? Mm-hmm. Okay, well then, this is what caught me not by surprise, but as you know, the State Department failed to designate Cuba as a not fully cooperating country when it comes to terrorism. The rationale was that Colombia's, frankly, how do I describe him, pro-Hamas, pro-communist, former M19 guerrilla president decided to no longer wants to extradite Marxist terrorists from Cuba. And then the Biden administration decided to resume law enforcement cooperation with the regime. Again, not to mention the fact that Cuba has thousands of intelligence agents in Venezuela, keeping Maduro in power. It is a terrorist regime. And so how does this coddling to a dangerous anti-American dictatorship with all of those issues that I just mentioned, that I know you're aware of, and so many others, how does that protect U.S. national security interests?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, the not fully cooperating statute requires an annual review, and the basis for the designation by the previous administration was the presence of these National Liberation Army members from Colombia in Cuba. The demand at the time by the Colombian government that they be returned to Colombia, the refusal of the Cuban government to do so, hence harboring terrorists. The change this year has been that the Colombian government no longer seeks their extradition, and as you noted, we've resumed law enforcement cooperation with Cuba in the national interest, and thus the basis for the designation was no longer there. There are other designations, as you well know, for Cuba that remain on the books, and of course, all of the acts that you rightly cited, we continue to push back against, take steps against, wherever and whenever we can. But in this particular case, given the annual requirement, given the basis for the designation, given the changing facts, that's the determination we made.
And Mr. Secretary, but again, as we mentioned in the beginning of this, my question, those are not the only terrorists that are harbored there, including folks who have murdered Americans.
And in many cases, we have fugitives from justice who are being accused, indicted, convicted of crimes different from terrorism.
Absolutely, absolutely. So again, I just found it hard to understand that the fact that a country decided to not ask for a group of terrorists to be sent back doesn't change the fact that there are other terrorists that are there, including ones who have killed Americans, who, by the way, the regime has refused to send back to the United States, for God's sake. But anyways, again, we'll continue the conversation, because I'm frankly taken back by that aspect. I am going to keep to the clock. I'm going to ask the rest of you to do the same. So with that, let me recognize the distinguished ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Of course, you know, and we're friends and colleagues, we disagree on Cuba, and we will continue this conversation because this 50-plus year policy of the United States toward Cuba with the embargo has not changed any dynamic that the chairman just mentioned, and we have to move toward having full normal relations with Cuba. Mr. Secretary, I know that you said this in your statement, believe in diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility. And I also know you're still struggling with a workforce that is still less diverse than the labor force, and it gets wider and more male at each rank of seniority. Culture change is hard. It takes time, but we also need urgently to see progress because the world won't wait for us to catch up. So how and what role does DEIA play in achieving this strategy? What metrics, quantifiable metrics, will you cite for your leadership tenure as evidence of success? And what do you think are the obstacles to the success, and how can we help you and your team overcome them? Because as I travel the continent of Africa, for example, and in the Caribbean, I still don't see the diversity that this country should be presenting in our foreign service.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. And let me just be clear at the outset why I think this is so important. To have a department that better reflects the people we represent. It's important because it's the right thing to do, but it's also important because it's the smart and necessary thing to do for our foreign policy and for our interests. We are operating in an extraordinarily diverse world. The greatest strength we bring to our ability to operate in that world and advance our interests is our own diversity. And if we are holding back, denying ourselves the talents of people from different backgrounds, different perspectives, different experiences, who have ways of engaging with the world that can make a real difference and help us solve problems by bringing these different perspectives to bear in our own policymaking, we're simply shortchanging ourselves. So it's imperative in my judgment that we continue to build a department that fully reflects our diversity. It is our strength around the world, and we've been working to do that. As you know, very early in my tenure, I appointed the first Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for the department. We now have the second one who's taken over, Zakiya Carr-Johnson, who's hit the ground running. Our first Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, and that office produced the DEAI strategic plan very early on, input from employees all over the world. We finalized that plan. We set out 215 objectives in it, and I can tell you that as of this moment, about 58%, or 125 of those objectives, have actually been met, and we're working to complete the others. I believe we've shared that plan with you, but we can go over exactly where we are. We have DEIA as a function now of performance evaluations to make sure that people are focused on that as part of their responsibilities as they seek to advance in the department. I'd note, and I thank Congress for this, for the first time, we were able to get paid internships at the department. And that is a wonderful tool for opening the socioeconomic aperture to make sure, again, that we have a department that's better reflective of the country, and that includes making sure that we have people from communities all over the country, rural as well as urban, who are able to try out the department through an internship and then decide whether they want to pursue a career there. We have a quantitative baseline for the first time. In January of '24, we published the third year of demographic data in a public dashboard that's available to everyone, and the dashboard provides a detailed snapshot of every bureau, broken out by race, by ethnicity, by gender, by disability status, by grade, by rank, by a place of origin in our country, and that will allow us, I think, to see clear trend lines over the next decade. And in terms of senior leadership selection, we have at the Deputy Assistant Secretary level and above, we've added new transparency to the process with clear criteria so that people can be clearly evaluated on the merits. Now, to your point, all of this takes time, and it's not
Yeah,
flipping
but
light
Mr. Secretary,
switches.
just very quickly, it takes time, but not 5 years, 10 years. We need to look, and you all need to look at new ways of breaking down these systemic barriers, because from what I've seen, first of all, retention is a problem.
Yep.
The cultural
That's
issues.
that's an important point. Can I just say on that? You're exactly right, because it's one thing to recruit people and bring them in, it's another thing to retain them. One of the things we've done is we've established a retention unit to try to understand why it is that people across the department may be leaving well before their time, and why, in particular, underrepresented groups may be leaving at a higher level. And that work is ongoing. We're learning a lot from that retention unit.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we will recognize the full committee chairman, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, as you know, the People's Republic of China has repeatedly used economic coercion against the United States, our allies, and frankly, non-aligned countries as well. Quite often trying to extract a political advantage or trap a country in a debt trap, literally, in order to have influence over its behavior. That runs very much counter, obviously, to a rules-based international order. So I'm wondering what you and the department are doing to counter those kinds of activities, and frankly, do you have the tools that you need? I know my colleague, Mr. Meeks, and I, along with Young Kim and Amy Barrow of the Foreign Relations Committee, actually have legislation to try and give you more tools to deal with that. So could you tell us how serious you view the problem, and what weapons you have and are using, and what weapons you might need?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think it's an important question and one we're very focused on. I'd say two things quickly about that. One is we want to make sure that wherever we can, we can create a better alternative for countries as they're looking at investment, because the main way that China exercises this coercion is, of course, by getting the leverage that comes through investments, including through Belt and Road. So we have done a tremendous amount of work putting together all of the resources and tools in our government, working with allies and partners through the PGI that the President established at the G7, Mineral Securities Partnership, and other things, to be able to effectively channel investment in places where it matters so that we can effectively compete. For us, of course, the secret sauce is the private sector. We're never going to match, and we shouldn't match China dollar for dollar when it comes to state investment. Our job is to be a catalyst of supporter for private sector investment. And as we do that, I think there's no question that most countries would prefer to work with us. However, the other side of this is when you see, exactly as you've said, examples of coercion being exercised, using economic leverage that China has to get countries to do things that it wants geopolitically. A good example of that was Lithuania a few years ago. And when Lithuania took steps in terms of its relationship with Taiwan that China didn't like, China tried to squeeze Lithuania. We came in, we worked with EXIM to generate about $600 million in financing as an alternative to the money that Beijing was pulling out or threatening to pull out. We had a defense procurement agreement that DOD put forward that was very helpful as well in going to the Lithuanians. Commerce helped to support and move supply chains away from the PRC. And we mobilized posts around the Indo-Pacific to help Lithuania find new markets for the markets that were being taken away when China was trying to exercise this leverage. So I think there's actually a pretty good model there, a good model actually in the way Australia responded to economic coercion some years ago from China. that we can build on. And we really welcome working with you to make sure that not only do we have the tools, but the tools are adequately financed so that we can come in and create the kind of resiliency. Last thing I'd mention is the European Union's also gotten into the game on this in a big way. They have important legislation so that if states are on the receiving end of economic coercion, the EU can come in and support them.
Well, again, we'd like to work with you on that, so if there are specific
you.
things that you would need that we could be helpful with, I'd like to know. One quick question, there's probably not enough time, but obviously we've all been intrigued by some of the things I've read, at least, about a potential agreement with Saudi Arabia. Could you give us some sort of overview of where you are in those negotiations and where you hope to be?
So we've been working, this goes back well before October 7th, working with Saudi Arabia and with Israel to pursue normalization between the two countries. This would be a game changer. It would be the first time that Israel has normalized relations with the largest Arab and Muslim country in the world in terms of its significance, and it would reshape the region and well beyond. We have pursued the work to try to get that agreement. It requires two things. It requires first some understandings and agreements between the United States and Saudi Arabia on security, on nuclear energy, and on defense cooperation. Those agreements, in principle, are very close to being able to be concluded. Now, of course, we will come to Congress with them when they're ready to be reviewed, but we could be really weeks away from being able to conclude them. However, in order for normalization to proceed, Saudi Arabia has made very clear that even with the agreements between us completed, they have to have two things. They have to have calm in Gaza, and they have to have a credible pathway to a Palestinian state. So we, of course, are working on both. We want to see both. Whether a government in Israel in this moment is able to engage on that basis, I don't know. What I do know is, until now, this has been a hypothetical or a theoretical question for Israel. Assuming we complete the agreements between the United States and Saudi Arabia, that hypothetical or theoretical question becomes a real question that they will have to answer one way or another.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Laura, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, as I previewed in my opening remarks, I first wanted to ask you about the House, what I view as a misguided allocation for fiscal year 2025 and the impact on the State Department's critical diplomacy and development work. I was interested in the line of questioning with all the initiatives that we are talking about with regard to the State Department that need to be discussed and need to be worked on. I think at the foundation of that is what kind of resources does the department have to move forward. At the recently announced top-line funding level for state and foreign ops for the appropriation bill proposes a nearly 12% cut. That's compared to the 2024 enacted level. It's on top of an almost 6% cut from fiscal years 2023 to 2024. Let me be extremely clear. Nearly 12% cut to the SFOP's budget is a staggering $7 billion. Billion with a B. So I have three questions in this regard, Mr. Secretary. You're deeply involved in conflicts in Ukraine, Middle East, maintaining a competitive advantage against China, trying to deal with other food assistance efforts around the globe. You have to conduct its day-to-day business from D.C. You're in almost every country in the world. How would losing $7 billion from the budget affect your department's diplomatic capabilities and the implementation of U.S. foreign policy?
Thank you. It would severely undermine our efforts across the board. As you said, this would take us back to FY 2014 funding levels. In other words,
2014.
almost a decade ago. And in terms of our hiring, in terms of our support for our diplomats, for our locally engaged staff, which is 2/3 of our employee base, in terms of our operations, in terms of our programs, this would have I don't want to exaggerate by saying devastating, but close to that impact on what we're able to do to actually advance the interests of the American people. If you look at the big things that we're trying to do, to effectively engage the strategic competition with China, including by creating better alternatives for countries that are looking to choose between our path and theirs, it would severely penalize those efforts. Our ability to continue to sustain support with our allies and partners for Ukraine and pushing back against Russian aggression, that would be severely undermined. Our ability to address a wide variety of global challenges that have impacts here in the United States, including things like the fentanyl crisis, as well as irregular migration, as well as dealing with climate and food security. Would each and every one of those be affected? No, because we'd have to make incredibly hard decisions, but some of them inevitably would be severely penalized. But let me be even more parochial about it, just to cite a few examples. Embassy security. We're trying to have more embassies in more places to make sure that we're fully represented. We want to open new embassies in the Pacific Islands, in the Caribbean. We need to secure those embassies. We would have trouble sustaining the current security levels for our existing embassies if we had these cuts. And then if you insulated those security programs, well, then of course the cuts would have to be felt elsewhere. Our ability to expand our diplomatic presence would probably be cut. The exchange programs that so many in Congress I know support and appreciate would face significant cuts. We'd probably have something like 600 or 700 fewer IVLP participants, curtailing one of our most valuable tools to connect with people around the world.
IDLP.
This is the International Visitors Leadership Program. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
We would have, I think, we want to open new passport offices in this country, in different places, to respond to what has been historic demand. We would not be able to do that. I can go down the list, and we'll obviously provide this list to Congress in the interest of time. I won't do it now. But both in terms of the big muscle movements that we need to make and very specific things that we want to sustain or grow for the American people, we would be severely penalized.
So we're looking at a loss of personnel, of frontline critical personnel, and thereby, just hurting our ability to pursue our own
That's correct.
interests. And the number of priorities that would have to be put on a back burner. And if you can, Mr. Secretary, I know how busy you are, and thereby your staff is busy, but I think it would be very, very helpful if this committee could understand what this $7 billion cut, what is the consequences? I'm not looking for percentages, I'm not looking for numbers, but the actual consequences on American foreign policy, our diplomacy, our stature in world leadership.
We'd be happy to provide that to you.
Thank you. I yield back.
And thank the ranking member. This subcommittee has amazing members, but I'll tell you what, for me, it's always a special honor to be able to recognize not only the Chairman Emeritus, the former Chairman of the subcommittee, but the Dean of the House, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for arranging this hearing with the Secretary and running it. And, Ms. Secretary, we're delighted to see you. We thank you for your service, and we pray for your safety. Fentanyl overdose is now the #1 killer of adults ages 18 to 45, destroying families, ruining lives. We've got to find a way to stop it. We know China and the Mexican cartels are the primary drivers of the problem. The Chinese ship the precursor chemicals to the Mexican cartels, who are then producing the pills and trafficking them through our borders. It seems that despite Beijing enacting new laws in 2019 to outlaw the export of fentanyl and its precursors, these efforts have not actually been enforced. Has China taken any sort of meaningful action to try to stop the export of these deadly drugs?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's very good to see you here as well. Two things. First, I wholeheartedly agree with you on the urgency, the priority that we have to place and we are placing on synthetic opioids and fentanyl. We see it devastating community after community in this country. 40% of Americans know someone who died of an opioid overdose. And as you point out, it's the #1 killer of Americans age 18 to 49. It has a domestic component, and the president has put more money into dealing with the domestic side of this in terms of prevention, in terms of treatment, in terms of recovery, in terms of public awareness than ever, and that money is getting to the communities that need it. I've seen it firsthand in Denver and Tucson and other places I visited. But for us at the State Department, we're working hard on the international side. And with regard to China, in December of last year, late November of last year, the president met with President Xi Jinping in San Francisco at the APEC summit. And a big part of that meeting and a big part of the work that we had done in the lead up to that meeting was to get an agreement from China to take more effective action against fentanyl, and particularly against the chemical precursors that are made in many cases in China, then, as you said, get shipped over to Mexico, synthesized into fentanyl, and then into our country where Americans are killed. China has taken important but not yet sufficient steps to make a real difference in curbing the flows. It promulgated new regulations. It took down some companies that were engaged in this practice. It established a regular working group with us so that we can track progress. I was just in China a few weeks ago, and among others, I met with the Minister of Public Security on this question. And there are steps that we believe China can and should take now to really make a dent in the flow of these chemical precursors. Very public law enforcement actions, particularly to arrest, prosecute, and convict those who are engaged in this illegal transfer of the precursors. That would, I think, send a very strong deterrent message. Actually scheduling certain precursors that they've agreed to schedule and thus restrict, but have not yet done. And then there's a nexus that we've seen between some enterprises in China, a financial nexus between them and the criminal enterprises in, for example, Mexico, that needs to be cut. And there, we believe that China needs to take action to do exactly that. So we are tracking this very closely, very carefully. I think we've seen progress, real progress, but it is not yet sufficient, and we want to see that the flow of the precursors continues to come down.
Well, we're all keeping an eye on China and what they're doing, or more importantly, what they're not doing to keep the fentanyl from reaching our kids and our adults in the U.S. I'm not sure that they're doing all that they can. In fact, I know that's the case. Your budget proposal, you're asking $1.56 billion for international narcotics control and law enforcement. That's a $166 million increase over the fiscal 24 enacted level. How do you plan to use those funds to help end this ongoing tragedy?
One of the most critical things is continuing to build the capacity of partner countries, as well as to strengthen our cooperation with them. I think Mexico is a good example of that. We've significantly increased our collaborative efforts over the last few years with Mexico to try to disrupt, dismantle, take down these transnational criminal organizations that are engaged in trafficking, as well as to deal with the financial networks. We have worked with them, for example, with information and support that's produced dozens of arrests of first and second tier operatives in these criminal enterprises. They've seized a record amount of fentanyl. They've disrupted production facilities, but all of that comes with our assistance, our support. So this is just one example of where the additional funds would allow us to further strengthen their own capacity to deal there. Second, the border itself. Very important that we deploy the most modern and effective technology in detecting efforts to smuggle fentanyl or other synthetic opioids into the United States. We have the technology. It's both the old kind, things like canines can be very effective, but also actual technology, screening technology. And we've seen that based on our best assessments, the overwhelming majority of the fentanyl that's coming into this country is coming through our ports of entry. And so deploying that technology on both sides, the Mexican side and our side, that can make a big difference.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I hate cutting off the dean, but I apologize, but I feel obligated to do so, Mr. Chairman.
If you insist.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Ms. Ming, who I know is not upset that the dean went a little bit long, correct? You're
No
recognized.
problem. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Blinken, before I ask my question, I wanted to thank you and your team for listening to the concerns about extended passport processing times that I raised last year in this hearing. Since then, standard processing times have been reduced to 6 to 8 weeks, and expediting processing is down to just 2 to 3 weeks.
Right.
My constituents and Americans all over the country have directly benefited from these improvements, and I urge you to continue to build on them heading into fiscal year '25 to continue to reduce passport and visa wait times for all of our constituents. My first question is, the fiscal year '25 budget request focuses on advancing peace and security in the Middle East. As we sit here, 124 hostages are being held by Hamas in Gaza, including American citizens. Today marks 228 days that they've been in captivity. As we know from those released, Hamas has inflicted deep psychological trauma and physical and sexual violence on the hostages, including women and children. Many require immediate medical attention, but Hamas still has not allowed the Red Cross to conduct a medical visit, and instead releases sign-of-life videos as propaganda. Many of us here have met with the families of the hostages, and I believe we can all agree that we need to bring them home now. How does the budget help the department increase pressure on Hamas and its allies to release the hostages and bring them home?
We share your conviction and commitment that bringing hostages home is our top priority. And like you, I've met with the families of these hostages many, many times. And it's important that you point out that among the hostages are American citizens, and my first obligation is to our fellow Americans. And so we've been determined to try to bring them home, and we've been working on this every single day since they were taken. You're right as well that the International Committee of the Red Cross has not been able to get in to see them. This is something we've also worked on. In the Gaza environment, that's a challenge, but we would like to see that in the interim happen. But the most important thing would be to get their release immediately. I think we've been very close to being able to get a ceasefire and hostage release on a couple of occasions. We continue to work on that. I think it is the fastest way to get the hostages home, get conditions changed in Gaza so that much more humanitarian assistance can get into the people who so desperately need it, and also create the foundation upon which to build, hopefully, a more durable, lasting, peaceful, and secure solution. So we continue to drive at that every single day, but to date, at the end of the day, when it's come down to making a decision, Hamas has not agreed to do what's necessary to get an agreement. But we continue at that, including with Egypt, Qatar, and other parties that have been helpful. The budget in supporting our diplomacy writ large, our ability to sustain that diplomacy, I think is critical. But of course, there are many other ways that I think the budget demonstrates our commitment to resolving these deep-rooted challenges, demonstrating that we have a better path forward than the path that's offered by Hamas of nihilism, of destruction, of terrorism, death, and all of our diplomatic efforts seek to move in that direction.
Thank you very much. And I wanted to quickly mention yesterday's CNN report that Egyptian mediators changed the text of the latest hostage deal at the last minute. Egypt is also refusing to allow more humanitarian aid into Gaza by opening the Rafah crossing, despite Israel's request to do so. Wanted to hear your thoughts about the accuracy of the reports and your assessment of Egypt's motivation for derailing the hostage negotiations, and what can the State Department do?
Well, two things. First, Egypt's been a critical partner in this effort in two ways. Critical partner in the effort to find an agreement on a ceasefire and hostages. A critical partner as well in trying to get humanitarian assistance into people in Gaza who need it. I can't comment on the details of the negotiations. The bottom line, though, is that Hamas has not said yes to what I think was a good proposal that was put on the table. And then with regard to humanitarian assistance, there is we have a deep concern about the Rafah gate, which I endeavored and President Biden endeavored to get open in October so that assistance could begin to flow into people who need it, that gate is closed. I think there are two things that are going on. One is, yes, it's important, I think, politically for the Egyptians to show that they are a critical actor in providing assistance. At the same time, because of combat activities near and around the gate, the environment for bringing the assistance in is really challenged. And so we need to find a way to make sure that the assistance that would go through Rafah can get through safely. But we do strongly urge our Egyptian partners to do everything that they can on their end of things to make sure that that assistance is flowing. What we don't want to see, and it's part of what we're seeing, is a reversal of the situation that we had where aid was not getting to the north where it was so desperately needed. We've got new gates and new access points open in the north, Erez, Zakim, others, things flowing in from Ashdod, only to have the south, which has been the critical hub for humanitarian assistance, be shut down in part because of the ongoing operations in and around the gate. So we're
Thank you,
working
Mr.
on that every
Secretary.
single day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Carl, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again, Mr. Secretary, for joining us today. I always find conversations with you to be quite interesting. Last time, when you appeared before us, this committee, which was last year, obviously, we discussed President Lopez Obrador's military invasion of the Vulcan Material Company's port in the property of Mexico, and we had quite an extensive conversation. I talked about my trip into Mexico, into Central America, trying to understand what's going on there. And of course, things have not changed much. But as you know, the military has since left after taking it by military force. And the president has continued to harass Vulcan and is actively threatening to steal the company's land to access that port. It's a deep water port that Vulcan actually built. They spent their own money, $1 billion worth of investments to build that port. And now Mexico's just going to take it. It is the image that we're given here. Last year, we agreed these type of actions would have a chilling impact on the bilateral relationship and future with U.S. investments in Mexico. Considering the ongoing situation, what message would you send to the president and the next president of Mexico and the U.S. business community?
Thank you very much. Yes, I remember well our conversation about this last year, and I'd say two things. First, Vulcan, I believe, has filed an arbitration case with under NAFTA, which is pending, and so I can't take a position on the merits of the case, which is pending. I can say that as a general matter, these cases, these instances, yes, can very much negatively impact Mexico's efforts to attract investment from the United States, and by the way, from many other countries as well. So we think it's very important that Mexico take that into consideration because it will have an impact on what they seek to do, which is to bring in more investment. But on the particular matter, let's see where the case goes before the arbitration panel.
Well, and as you say that, American-based companies are losing a lot of money. What was mined or what is being mined from that facility is building roads here in America. It's very important in our infrastructure. And I know this administration has put a lot of emphasis on infrastructure.
That's right.
Why do we not support our American businesses more? Why aren't we letting the avocados and the fruits and vegetables sit at the border for a little while and let them figure out time frame? Because waiting a year, 2 years, 4 years for a court to work it out is not working. It's not working at all.
My hope and expectation would be that precisely because we tried to put, I believe the previous administration put processes into NAFTA, the revised NAFTA, that would enable it to look at these kinds of cases and act swiftly on them, not bottle them up for years. I think you're exactly right. It's imperative that happens. But there is a mechanism, there is an understanding about how we try to resolve these disputes, and that should play out, but it should, I agree with you, play out quickly. Meanwhile, we have our diplomats all over the world engaged every single day in commercial advocacy, commercial diplomacy, trying to resolve disputes, trying to make sure that our businesses, our workers are being treated fairly around the world. It's a critical part of their mission, and whether that's in Mexico or any other place around the world, where the United States and our businesses are engaged. That's what our folks are there for every single day. And we, of course, will look at whatever measures are appropriate to try to make sure that we're being treated fairly with a level playing field.
Well, if the president of Mexico will do this to Vulcan Materials, they'll do it to anyone. And I highly encourage business communities in America that's looking at doing business down there to stop and think, because they may be next.
Thank you.
With that said, Mr. Chairman, I yield my time.
Well, thank you, Mr. Carl. Thank you for bringing this up. Look, this president of Mexico is acting less like an ally and more like an adversary. And so, thank you for bringing that up, sir. The gentleman from Florida, Ms. Frankel.
Good morning, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you so much for your good work in a very chaotic world, and I give the same praise to our president. I may not agree on every little detail, but I have to say, given the chaos of this world, I am very grateful for his very steady, experienced leadership. I am disappointed with the top lines of this budget, of course, because, again, with the chaos in the world, I do think more diplomacy and economic stability would bring us to more peace. I was in a meeting yesterday with 6 women ambassadors from around the world, including from Ukraine, including from Saudi Arabia, Lithuania. I'll try to think of the other ones, and Ireland and others. And here's what we got talking about is there are many conflicts in this world, and we know that there are some negotiations going on in the conflicts. And to our dismay, in talking to these ambassadors, what they were relating to us is there are very few, if no women, at the negotiating table. The ambassador from Saudi Arabia told me she's been the only woman at the table. And, number one, we know research shows that when women are part of the negotiations for peace, much likely that a treaty will last longer. But number two, we do bring a very different perspective. And so what I would like to hear from you is, what are the various conflicts around the world that we're actually participating in peace negotiations, and where are the women?
Thank you. First of all, I agree with the premise of the question or the statement, which is when we have women involved in matters of peace and security, we get better results. And I think we need to see and do more of that. And as you know, we have a Women, Peace, and Security initiative to try to ensure that. But if you look around at the conflicts that we're working every single day to resolve, to bring to an end, particularly many, alas, in Africa, whether it's in Sudan, whether it's the DRC and Rwanda and the Eastern Congo, whether it's challenges in Ethiopia, well, our Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, Molly Fee, is leading many of our efforts in those situations. We have a number of senior diplomats who are engaged around the world every day in trying to bring conflicts to an end. And I could go down the list, and I'm sure that you would find women who are critical leaders in those efforts. But again, I think the initiatives that we have to make sure that there is greater participation, engagement, involvement from women in dealing with these challenges, that's very much part of what we're doing. We have a strategy. We have an update that is being sent forward. Actually, we sent forward last year on that, and it reaffirms our commitment to elevate women's meaningful participation and protection on the other side of things as critical elements of our foreign policy and conflict prevention and conflict resolution.
Okay, well, let me, and I know there's so many stressors, but I want to respectfully suggest that the State Department and the administration make more efforts to get the women at the table. I mean, it's really embarrassing or disappointing, I would say, when we heard that incidentally, the ambassador of Saudi Arabia did recount to us almost exactly what you told us this morning about the negotiations. So hopefully you're all on the same page there. But it was very disappointing when she tells us that when you're all sitting down to talk, she was the only woman in the room. Should be a non-starter. So we're going to urge you to do better with that. We're going to have another round, is that right? Yeah, so I want to talk about a film I saw last night called Screams of Silence, it's about the sexual violence committed by Hamas. I will say this, the last time I almost ran out of a movie, it was one of these horror movies but this was those things are make-believe but this was real. What I saw and heard last night was so horrifying, really, I could barely sit in my seat. And we didn't even see the pictures. We just saw the interviews. I'm going to talk more about that, Mr. Chair, when we do the second round.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Mr. LaTurner.
Thank you, Mr.
You're recognized, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today, Secretary Blinken. I'm sure you're aware of the growing problem throughout Southeast Asia of scam compounds, often run by Chinese organized crime groups that are targeting more and more Americans every year. These fraud factories, which are increasingly prevalent in Burma, Cambodia, Thailand, can contain thousands of individuals who are trafficked, held against their will inside these compounds, and then forced to help perpetrate online scams referred to as butchering, where they develop a relationship with their victim and then push them into investing in fraudulent cryptocurrency apps or platforms. A recent estimate found that global losses from this type of activity have exceeded $64 billion. Can you share what the State Department is doing to combat not just this ongoing fraud, but also the human trafficking that contributes to it?
Thank you, and thank you for putting a spotlight on that, because it's something that is of deep concern to us. We have a comprehensive whole-of-government effort to combat trafficking persons and to combat different manifestations of that, including these scam factories. Literally, and this is something that the State Department helps lead, we have every relevant department in the government coming together, using its resources and doing it in a coordinated way to combat trafficking and to combat these different manifestations of it. And there are significant resources that go into that. There is a very significant effort to help countries develop the capacity themselves to push back against trafficking, to bring traffickers to justice, to help the victims of trafficking. And so building their capacity is critical. Law enforcement collaboration and cooperation is vital to this. Sharing information, of course, we have an annual trafficking in persons report that we put out that looks at countries, country by country, to see what they're doing or not doing. And what more needs to be done to get at the heart of this. But there's a very significant effort underway to deal with that.
Are you seeing the needle move on this particular issue?
We see it move in individual countries. I think, there are a number of countries, and the report makes this clear, where we've seen genuine, effective progress. There are other countries where we've seen backsliding or no progress, and the report lays all of this out.
Right. Recently, Amnesty International in Nigeria stated that over 1,300 people have been killed just in Plateau State alone since December, when the horrible Christmas massacres killed over 200 people, mostly Christians. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, in its recently released annual report, noted a study saying over 8,000 Christians have been targeted and murdered for their faith in Nigeria, most of them in the North and Middle Belt. These targeted killings have been increasing year over year, and especially now at such an alarming rate that it's hard to see how these militants are not operating with some degree of impunity. Secretary Blinken, since you removed Nigeria from the country of particular concern list in 2021, the U.S. CIRF has recommended Nigeria be placed back on the list, and every year since, and has condemned its removal. The U.S. CIRF has affirmed that government toleration of egregious, systematic, and ongoing violations of religious freedom is the standard for CPC status, and they make it very clear that Nigeria meets at least that standard. Given the horrendous targeted violence in the country that is at least in significant part motivated by religious factors, given these factors, why has the State Department for every year failed to follow the U.S. CIRF's recommendations regarding a CPC designation?
First, let me say this. For us, defending religious freedom around the world is a foreign policy priority. And we are leveraging the global footprint that we have, our presence around the world that we want to sustain, to focus on cases of concern, to push back against repressive discriminatory laws, policies, and practices. Much of this is highlighted, as you mentioned, in the annual report that we do, and this is at the heart of our efforts. We have in the law designation criteria that we take very, very seriously. We listen carefully to experts in civil society, experts on the ground. Our embassies are doing a tremendous amount of work in each of these countries, including Nigeria. And we listen very carefully to the independent U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom.
But they're wrong, they're wrong in this case.
So in this case, and we have I think we have a different perspective in this particular case about whether, there's no doubt, it is clear that people of Christian faith in Nigeria have been on the receiving end of terrible abuses, oppression. But whether that is because of their religion or because they're part of a particular ethnic group in a particular region, that's a different question. And what we have not seen is the government of Nigeria, the federal government of Nigeria, engaging in these practices in terms of targeting Christians. Having said that, I was in Nigeria, I'm trying to remember exactly when, but I think it was within the last 6 or 7 months. And I brought together experts from civil society, from the religious communities, including leader of the Christian community in Nigeria, to hear directly from them. We talked to the government about the imperative that even if things were not being done at its behest or its acquiescence, that it take stronger action to protect people, and notably Christians who were, whether or not it was because of their religious status, being persecuted. And so this is something we're very focused on, irrespective of the designation.
I'm out of time, but I would hope we could find common ground at least on the special watch list designation. But I look forward to talking more about this.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Chairman, and good morning, Mr. Secretary. It's good to see you. When you came before the subcommittee last year, we spoke about the administration's goals in Central America to help stem the number of migrants, specifically the young people at our southern border, by ensuring that they have safety and opportunity to thrive within their own countries. Since that hearing, I'm very happy to see the steps that you have taken in the Northern Triangle, including progress on diplomatic appointments, as well as publicly naming corrupt and undemocratic actors. I want to encourage you to continue to work with U.S. Treasury to not only remove their visas, but freeze their assets so that we can make some real change in the region for those young people to be able to see a future that includes democracy and improve their lives in the region. Guatemala, in particular, faced a coup attempt last year, and now a step toward building an independent judiciary. The appointment process for many key judicial posts this year. Mr. Secretary, we must prioritize those governments who are our true partners, committed to democracy and investing in their own people to help build a better future for all of the Americas. Mr. Secretary, you have asked this committee for increased funding for the Western Hemisphere. It's a tough request, given, from my point of view, that we continue to see Russia continuing to run a mine in El Estor. Right now, there are hundreds of military and police officers that are seeking to once again commit brutal crimes against 29 families that remain there. 29 families of the families that were burnt out of their community. Most of them are indigenous people. These are the young people that we see at our southern border. The last time they unleashed violence on this group, they utilized our own military equipment, JA Jeeps, that I had specifically requested that we remove from the region. So how will this funding be used responsibly to address the root cause of migration from Central America and continue to support the young people, but not continue to support old regimes like Giammattei, like Jimmy Morales, the past ghosts of, violence, and give this new administration an opportunity to thrive and make the change that is necessary.
Thank you very much. As it happens, I was in Guatemala just a few weeks ago.
Thank you for that.
And had a very good visit there. I'm impressed by the work that President Rebelo and his administration are doing, and it's something that we strongly support and will continue to do. Second, I think we've seen when it comes to tackling root causes, because primarily, not exclusively, drivers of irregular migration, which is at historic levels around the world, and of course in our own hemisphere as well. One of the main drivers is a lack of basic economic opportunity. And if people can't put food on the table for their kids to eat, they will do anything and go anywhere to try to make sure that they can do that.
I don't know about y'all, but I love my mayor. Oh, wow. Can I take my time? I am just so humbled and so grateful to the citizens of Fulton County who made this possible. Tonight, they delivered a strong and a powerful message. They want a district attorney that believes everyone deserves to be safe and everyone is entitled to some dignity. And it's a message that's pissing folks off, but there is no one above the law in this country, nor is there anyone beneath it. You all, 4 years ago when I came and took this seat, me and that man over there, Chief Meadows of the city of South Fulton, we were really frustrated because we were telling people there was a gang problem. And people were acting like we had two heads. They said there was a gang problem in Chicago. There was a gang problem in LA. Might have been a gang problem in DC, but there was not a gang problem in Atlanta. And we were saying, no, there is. And if you don't deal with reality, reality will deal with you. And so we put into effect a balanced approach. But I need everyone in here to understand, this is just a pause. We are not to the end of the road. In fact, I submit to you, we're at the beginning. The campaign does not end tonight. It